Knight and Changeling, Chapter 11, Stolen. I'm sorry, back up. Area 51 is missing? Jen asked as Kevin drove the Rust Bucket 3 to the side of the apparently vanished base. Grandpa Max nodded. That's the report. Gwen looked up from her tablet where she was finishing up some homework. How does an entire army base go missing? What about the people working inside? Max frowned. That's the odd thing. They're all fine. They showed back up not 10 minutes after the base vanished, in a flash of light. No one was hurt. No one knows what happened. Only clue we have is the two unconscious guards. Jen nodded at her grandfather. They may have seen it coming. Jen said, Who's already there? She asked, and Max smiled. Pierce called me. He's there with a small crew of plumbers. Colonel Rosem is there too. Cooper's handling the tech side. He's there too. Blukich and Dreba don't leave the lab too often, which is probably a good thing. Jen grinned. She'd properly met the two Galvins now, and they weren't up to Azimuth's level by any means. But they were nice, if eccentric, and shared her love of smoothies. She had already gotten in their good books with a gift of several smoothies and the novelty straws currently sold at the smoothie place. They arrived not too long after and discovered that, yes, the base was just gone. Jen frowned as she looked over the crater that had been the base. Max was greeting the colonel, and Pierce called Jen over, but he wasn't exactly happy. You need to see this. She frowned as Pierce pulled her over to the hole. Cooper was at the bottom of the crater, standing atop a massive metal structure. Jen frowned. The hell is that? She slid down the side of the crater and tapped Cooper on his shoulder. What do we have? He asked. She asked. He frowned. Jen, it's a prison. And it's full, from the records I've been able to decipher anyway. Over 700 prisoners. All alien. Jen's eyes narrowed. She twirled the dial on the Ultimatrix and transformed into Big Chill. She heard Colonel Rosem shout from the top of the crater, Stay out of there! But she didn't listen, going intangible and diving into the prison. It was worse than she could have imagined. The conditions were beyond terrible. Cruel and unusual would be more accurate. There was a tiny space with a small computer console. Jen glided over to it and quickly hacked the system. She'd have to thank Kevin for the lessons in hacking later. She swooped through the prison, taking stock of the conditions. They were far from acceptable. Rage bubbled under her skin as she phased back through the roof of the prison. Colonel Rosem was there with Cooper and Grandpa Max. Pierce was still topside talking to the people who'd been in the base when it vanished. You're running an illegal alien prison. Jen had to be physically restrained from smacking Rosem, which was only achieved because Grandpa Max stepped in her way. He spluttered and claimed that the prison was perfectly legal under the American government as the aliens weren't people. Jen snarled at him. You know perfectly well that holding any sentient being without trial either by a jury of their peers as dictated by local government or by the plumber officer in the nearest jurisdiction is against galactic law. Rosem stopped sputtering and blinked. Even Max looked impressed that she could cite galactic law without even pausing, but Jen was far too angry to care. You have 774 living beings in conditions that are no way livable. She was livid, steam hissing from her mouth, tiny drops of ice crystallizing in the air. That's not right, Rosem said, and Jen's eyes narrowed. You're gonna deny what I just saw with my own eyes? She spat at him. Rosem shook his head. No, your count's off. There should be 775. He said it like he was counting stock in a grocery store. If Pierce's plumber ship hadn't taken off on its own, Jen might very well have attacked the colonel on the spot. Chasing down the escaped alien, who decided that the best way to get revenge for his wrongful imprisonment was to hunt down Colonel Rosem's family, was less than fun. But by the end of the night, they had him in plumber custody, where he belonged. The plumbers had been given the go-ahead by Rosem's superiors to clear out the prison that had been under Area 51. Jen flew back to help Pierce and the other plumbers clear it out. It was slow going. Many of the prisoners were mistrusting of the human plumbers. Jen eventually called in a few other plumbers from the Bellwood base to help with the evacuation of the prisoners. It went much smoother after that. It still took them 2 days to clear out the prison in its entirety. Jen sighed and sat on the edge of the crater. Shortly, she was joined by Cooper, who held out a water bottle. One of the plumbers recently arrived from Bellwood had brought supplies for the plumbers working to free the aliens and the trapped aliens themselves. "So, how's life in the lab?" Jen asked after a long pull of water. Cooper shrugged. Not bad. Pretty fun, actually. Azimuth talked to me a while back. Apparently that's a big deal." Jen snorted. "Cooper, he barely makes time to talk to me. It's a pretty big deal." He laughed lightly. "What did he want to talk about?" "The DNA guns. He had an idea that they could be used to alter... They could be altered to cure more than just people." Jen nodded. "A good idea. Hopefully we won't have to use them again." The summons was odd. No one seemed to know who had sent it out, though all the High Lords of the Forever Knights were present. They were starting to believe it was a trap of some kind, a setup by one of their number. The verbal fighting swelled to drawn swords before a voice cut through the chatter. "Enough! You have all forgotten your ancient duty. The duty the knights were formed for in the first place." The man who stepped out was not impressive, not until he bested Driscoll and his knights single-handedly. The knights all stared as he took the seat at the head of the table. "It has been too long since the knights served their original purpose, the purpose I created them for." All sound stopped as the knights dropped to their knees around him. "We will restore the honor of this order, and to do that, I require a meeting with Jennifer Tennyson." Chapter 12. Duel. Max was having a regular day. He was on monitor duty, keeping an eye on Jen, Gwen, and Kevin fighting the giant bipedal elephant calling himself Trombibulor. He was not expecting a teleport flash into the main hall of the base, nor was he expecting what materialized. Pierce cried out in pain as he landed with an unpleasant, wet noise on the floor. Max was already on his feet, calling for a medic when he spotted the blood. A small device dropped from Pierce's hand, one of Cooper's experimental short-range teleporters. Max knelt next to the kid, who whimpered. There was a substantial hole in his side, bleeding sluggishly and burned at the edges. Laser fire. Max carefully scooped him up and set him on the hover gurney the medics brought with them. He ran alongside it. "Kid, what happened? It was supposed to be your night off." Pierce grimaced. "It was. Went on a date and everything." Max frowned. "She do this to you?" He shook his head. "No. Forever Knights. Tracked me down, wanted me off the planet. Max, they're more armed than I've ever seen them." Pierce's eyes fluttered and the doctor shoved Max back. "We're losing him!" They raced into the med bay, leaving Max behind. His hands were shaking and stained with his student's blood. Jen was annoyed when Argit showed up, facilitating Trombibulor's escape. She wasn't sure how he'd escaped lockup at the Plumber Academy. They hadn't seen him since, but his claim that someone was forcing aliens off Earth was enough to get them interested. A trip to Bauman's grocery store revealed the whole plot, and if she was honest, it made Jen's blood boil. The Forever Knights were wiping out aliens. Rumor had it they had killed a young plumber, too. No time to check on that now. They had 3 hours until Mr. Bauman's second shipment of the week came in, the perfect time for the Knights to lay a trap, so Jen decided to lay one of her own. Driscoll was proud of himself. He was doing honorable work, forcing the aliens to vacate the planet or die. This should prove a fruitful raid. So he was a bit shocked when one of the smaller hooded figures stepped forward and threw down a glove in front of him. The Knights paused. I would have used a gauntlet, but I didn't have one with me. A familiar voice echoed from the hooded figure. She reached up and pulled off the cloak, and he glared into the face of Jennifer Tennyson. "So, what'll it be? Swords or lances? You have both. Or are you going to let your honor be questioned by a woman?" He growled as the crowd of aliens pulled back towards the warehouse, and his knights looked to him. He had to accept the challenge, or he would be marked a coward and thrown from the order. He nodded to one of his knights, and the man lowered his laser lance and drew his sword, tossing it at the girl's feet. She kicked away the cloak and picked up the sword. They circled each other. Despite the initial surprise of the challenge, Driscoll was certain he would win this. The girl had no experience with a sword after all. Or at least, that was what he'd been told. That was what he'd been led to believe. But he appeared to have been lied to, as she dropped into a perfect fighting stance and quickly broke his defense, knocking his sword from his grip, stepping down hard on his foot and driving the pommel of her sword into his sternum. Even with the armor, he felt something crack as he was knocked on his ass. He blinked, finding the sword in her hand at his throat. "Call off your men. Call off your crusade, or I will put an end to it myself." He blinked at her. There was no more of the childish laughter in her eyes. It had been replaced with the steel of a seasoned warrior. The air was still for a moment as they stared each other down. "Stand down, men. She's won." The knights made themselves scarce quickly. Jen checked over the families Mr. Bauman had been hiding. They were all fine. Kevin frowned at Jen.
"How'd you know they'd back off after that?"
Jen smiled slightly. Nothing matters more to a knight than their honor. He just got beat at his own game by a girl. Gwen laughed slightly as the aliens began to head home. Mr. Bauman offered them lunch, but Jen insisted they needed to head back to base. She wasn't sure what she'd find when she got there. She just hoped that whoever Driscoll had attacked of the plumbers would still be alive when they got there. George was disappointed, to say the least, though in hindsight he supposed he was lucky only one of the factions of his knights had split into had gone off the rails. Driscoll knelt before him, eyes downcast. "Your loss to her is not what dishonors you, Driscoll. It is your endangerment of innocence." George nodded to his men. They seized Driscoll and quickly disarmed him, binding his hands behind his back. "Drop him and his men off for Tennyson to find." His men began to drag Driscoll off. "Wait." They paused. George picked up a piece of paper and wrote down something on the front, then flipped it and scribbled something else on the back. He took a pin out of his bag and pinned the note to Driscoll's doublet. "At least you can be good for one thing." He nodded at his men, and they dragged off the stunned-looking knight. Jen sat outside the med bay, her head in her hands. Kevin was in the cafeteria getting both of them something to eat. Gwen had a major test the next morning and had to duck out, but told Jen to call her as soon as there was any news. Jen took a deep breath as her communicator went off. "Yes? Miss Tennyson, there's an interesting package for you here." Jen glanced at the door to the medbay. "Can you sign for it? I'm sort of waiting to hear if one of my friends is dying or not." "I'm sorry, Miss Tennyson, this isn't the kind of package one can sign for." Jen rolled her eyes. "Fine, I'll be up in a minute." Jen stood and quick-stepped up to the elevator. Kevin got off as she reached the doors. He frowned, holding out a cup to her.
"Where are you going?"
Jen shook her head. "Apparently, I have mail only I can sign for." She took the drink and got on the elevator. "Call if they say anything about Pierce before I get back." He nodded as the door slid closed. But when she reached the main floor, she found that it wasn't really a package. It was an unconscious Sir Driscoll. He was much more bruised than he had been just a few hours before when she'd seen him last. Pinned to his doublet was a note. Raising an eyebrow, she tore it off. "To Jennifer Tennyson with my apologies, the man who shot the young plumber." She flipped the note and nearly smiled. "Put him in holding until Pierce wakes up. And contact Bauman. He'll give you the names of a few families I know would be more than happy to press charges against this ass." She slipped the note into her pocket. "If you need me, I will be in the med bay." She turned on her heel as several of the plumbers began to process the Forever Night. She stepped onto the elevator and pulled out the note again. Flipping it over, she smiled at the phone number scribbled on the back. She knew that handwriting all too well. She pulled out her phone and keyed in the number. "Good to hear from you." She typed out and hit send. Her phone pinged as she stepped out of the elevator. "You as well, my young friend. Dinner?" Jen glanced over at Kevin. "Soon."